We're ready to go. Welcome to Bible Basics. Tonight we are studying the books of Chronicles. And so I thought we'd start with the definition of a chronicle, right? So a chronicle is a factual written account of important or historical events, usually written in chronological order. That's where the book gets its name, Chronicles. And you may remember from before that like Kings and Samuel, First and Second Chronicles were originally all one book, but they were too long to fit on one scroll. So that's why we have First and Second Chronicles. So we're going to start with your homework assignment, which was to bring something that chronicles your family, if you have something. So I know not everybody did, but I understand that Greg did. Greg, do you want to share with us?
Okay, I'll have my highlights. Well, I have a cousin who was a U.S. congressman. I'm a first cousin 2 times removed, so that was in the mid-60s. Then I'm also a direct descendant from the Mayflower.
Yeah.
Richard Warren, he was on the Mayflower, and he had more descendants than any other person that was on the Mayflower. I'm one of those.
So can we call you Pilgrim Greg now?
Yes. Yeah.
I need to get him a hat, right?
Yeah.
James Moore, he had a big farm on Barbados, the island of Barbados, in the 1600s, and his great grandson or grandson was a master carpenter in Kentucky, and he made I got a whole stack of buildings and things that he made. He was real famous, made governor's man. So that's the highlights of. I'm the direct descendant of 6 different Confederate veterans, and one War of 1812 veteran.
Wow.
That's it.
So if Chronicles is the writing down of all of those things, how do you know that? How do you know who you're a descendant of?
Well, my cousin was real big into ancestry, and she had all the information, and she invited me to be a guest on her ancestry page.
Yeah.
And so from there, I went ahead and paid a membership, and so I had access to all her stuff. So that was a ton of stuff. And then from there, when you get into the Ancestry.com thing, I met some cousins that they contacted me, and we had a big family reunion up in Kentucky. I've never met any of those people, but I was the only one person they could find from one member, and he had been like a county clerk or something in one of the counties in Kentucky. So anyway, Ancestry.com, and then I started working on Susan's Ancestry too. So
Okay.
that was a lot of fun, Ancestry.com, if you ever.
Very cool. So Ancestry.com is like a modern day chronicle, isn't it?
It is pretty much.
Yeah. So let's find out.
It's just a line pretty much like his. I don't have anything
Turn around and show them.
I don't have anything as
Okay.
awesome as his.
Well, she had one who was a sailor. I thought it was pretty interesting, but I'm not a member anymore, so I couldn't look at all the details of a sailor that came into New Orleans years ago from France.
Okay.
He was just a sailor on a boat. I thought that was pretty cool.
Yeah, they come. My ancestry goes back to France. We did trace it back. We've got all the way back to the 1500s.
Wow.
So that's pretty awesome. Yeah. So I guess whoever did these chronicles, was like, for them it was probably like awesome, because now they knew what their line was. So not
all
that
right.
they knew anybody.
So does anybody else have a chronicle of your family? No.
Now, my sister's the keeper of our family's chronicle, and she couldn't produce anything.
Yeah. I brought one of ours.
I keep forgetting.
I found this when I was looking.
Oh, cool.
And it's engraved. It says the Hudson family. That's my maiden name, is Hudson. And it's King James, in case you're wondering. My favorite. But if you open it up, there's our family tree.
That's
in
neat.
there.
Wow.
That's cool.
And so that goes all the way to my great-grandparents
That's awesome.
there, who my great-grandfather, I guess, was marrying Hudson Lindsay. I don't know how that works. But anyway, he was born in 1842 and died in 1916. And so that goes all the way down. Interesting to note, and I'm thinking my grandmother probably wrote this, like probably when my parents got married, this was a wedding gift, would be my guess, because it has parents on here, which are my dad's parents. And then if you turn the page, it has children, and my dad is listed first. It listed when he graduated from college, so I think that was probably a point of pride for them. And he would have been the first in his family, I guess, to do that. And then when he was discharged from the Marine Corps. Also lists his brother, who died at 6 months of age, and who we always knew growing up that we had an uncle and knew him and saw his picture and everything, but he only lived 6 months.
Wow.
Kind of crazy. And then my brother's in here too, and along with his discharge from the military and when he died, my brother died when he was 20. And another cool thing I noticed in here about my grandmother and her family, she has a lot of question marks. So she was actually grew up as a foster child and didn't know who her parents were or their dates of birth, and her birth certificate burned in a fire. So she made up her own name and her own birthday.
Wow.
And she had a foster family that she grew up with a lot, and they were like a part of our family, but she wasn't one of them.
Right.
And so anyway, that's one of the chronicles that's along my dad's side. My mom's side, we have a cousin who's a historian, and so my mom's side of the family, we know a lot more about our ancestry there, and on both her mother's side and her dad's side.
Oh, that's cool.
So if you were to go along my grandfather's side, you would find Al Gore not too far of our family tree.
Really?
Yes.
That's the pride of the family, huh?
Yeah, he's probably the best.
Please don't repeat that.
Yeah, with other people. Anyway, but I think it's interesting how people chronicle their families these days, because there's different ways to do it. And it seems to me that today we're more likely to chronicle our families in pictures, right? So,
I have a lot of pictures, but the thing is, I don't have it like it's all in chronological order, but there's so many albums of it, it gets ridiculous.
Yeah.
So it's not all in one concise place.
Yeah. We have a lot of photographs tossed in boxes that are not in albums. And Alan, we have some of your family too, and some of those really old pictures that were like, I don't know who those are. And so interesting to me, on my dad's side of the family, my great grandfather would have died in 1917. But in this picture, the color picture, my great grandfather is sitting in the middle with a white flower on. And so he was a big part of my childhood, and that's my great grandmother sitting next to him. They were the Youngs, and so I'm one of the young cousins, and that's where my cousin is. That's a historian, and so we know a lot about that family.
That's awesome.
But also it's all the kids on the left. There were 9 of them. And then, I don't know how to get back there. Let's see, maybe go this way. There we go. There were 9 kids. And then let me see if I can shrink this. These are the same 9 kids with their parents on the right. And
that's fun.
My grandmother's sitting in the bottom right, the floral dress on. So anyway, cool that they all lived to old age, and most of them had children, which means that our cousins, when we had a family reunion, that's where this picture was made, there would have been 100 or more people there easily.
Awesome.
And but when I look at her side of the family, most of the chronicling we have there is in photographs, which is really cool. So they didn't have that in the days of the Bible, though, right? They didn't even have good drawings,
Just words.
When you think about it, then it's amazing that they were able to keep track of family members and lines like that as they were, right? Yeah. So Bryce and Nathan, how many relatives do you know? Like, did you know your grandparents? Your great-grandparents?
We know one of our great-grandparents.
Yeah.
We know our grandparents on both sides.
Yeah. That's
Can
cool.
y'all get me water?
Yeah.
Or turkey?
Yeah,
Okay.
no.
And what about cousins? You have a lot of cousins, so, right? Yeah, very cool. Very cool. So did you ever think about the Bible as being part of your family history too? Yeah, the Bible's kind of our chronicle
Not kind
too.
of. My mother's cousin was that passed in Missouri.
Yeah,
Oh, that's
there you
cool.
go.
But you know, and I don't know.
Well, but next time I share it, and so she
Yeah,
would
Sherry,
know the entire
my niece got all kinds of stuff. She went back to 1600. She got all that information.
Oh, that's
history.
cool.
Didn't you ask her?
I would have to go out there and stay a week so I could get it.
Yeah.
So I could do
Yeah, we're
that.
You'll
kind
have
of
to get her
busy
to give you a
last
copy
week.
of it.
Yeah.
I think other ways people chronicle their families these days, Facebook, right? So that's like, I have that cousins group I'm in, and then he posts all kinds of pictures on there. Some people would keep newspapers and scrapbooks of their family and where they were in the news and stuff. So there's lots of different ways, but more often than not, how we find out about our family is just from knowing them and from your parents talking about them and that kind of thing. So anyway, so that's why we're talking about Chronicles tonight. And Chronicles is probably seen as one of the most boring books in the Bible, but when you start to think about it, it's a family history, and that's kind of a cool thing. Because even as it talks about all the different people, even when we just get a name, behind each one of those names is a story and a life, and that person mattered. And I think it would be pretty cool to have your name in the Bible, even if it was just your name and nothing
My
about
name
you.
in the Bible.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yes it is.
Many
That's a cool thing. So, okay, so Chronicles then is from the genre of history. And if we look at our eras, it's considered part of the kingdom era, but here's the weird thing. Ezra wrote Chronicles in approximately 430 BC. And if you were to have a copy of the Jewish Bible, Chronicles would actually be the last book, which means it would actually come after Ezra and Nehemiah and Esther. And because really starts the ancestry with Adam, and then at the very end of the book is when they're returning from exile. So even though it's considered part of the kingdom era, there is also things in there, at least mentions in there of the exile and of the return as well. So it makes it a pretty cool book because we believe that Ezra wrote it. That's the Jewish tradition says that he wrote it. But what it does is it kind of looks back at the history of Israel with a purpose. Also, the First Chronicles, the book of First Chronicles parallels what you read in First and Second Samuel, and Second Chronicles tends to parallel what you read in First and Second Kings. So that's also why people think it's boring. First of all, it starts out with lists of names, but then also when you're reading through it, you're like, I think I already read this.
Yeah.
And so a lot of that is because it's retelling the same stories in part from those other books. Okay. All right. So basically, First Chronicles then starts off with a family tree. And this is not the actual family tree. This is kind of a cool picture, though.
That is neat.
It starts with Adam and Eve. Sorry. There we go. It starts with Adam and Eve and goes down from there. And then on the right, you see Shem, who was Shem's father. Do you remember?
No.
Noah. Noah was Shem's father. And the descendants of Shem, so usually if somebody was a descendant, they added "ite" to the end of their name, right? So if Tim had a family, then all his family would be the Timites, right? And if Greg had a family, his family would be the Gregites. And that's how they named their people, right? So Shem's line, though, were called the Semites. And so today you hear that word, you usually hear like don't be anti-Semitic.
Right.
That comes from the name of Shem. I didn't know that either.
That's awesome.
Very cool. So the first 9 chapters of First Chronicles is this family tree of sorts, and it starts at Adam, and it goes through Abraham, and then the 12 tribes. And there's a special emphasis on David and on Saul, and then it actually even includes some of the families who are returning from exile, which we haven't even talked about exile yet, because we'll do that next when we get a little more into Ezra and Nehemiah. And so, but that's basically the family names. Inside of those family trees, then, it's just this big mush of names. But remember, each one of those names is a story. And a lot of the people that are listed end up being enemies to the Israelites, right? So Canaan was a son of Ham, so Noah's grandson. His people became the Canaanites.
Right.
And they lived in the promised land before Israel did, right? You also see the Edomites. Do you remember does anybody know who the Edomites descended from? Was
Ed,
brother.
Oh.
not Ed.
No, Ed makes sense. Yeah. No, it was actually Esau. Esau was actually called Edom. And so his descendants were called the Edomites. And they were pretty much at war with the Israelites for most of history, right? Because of that sibling rivalry that started even when they were younger at home, right? So another name that you may have heard of is Jabez. Does anybody know who Jabez is?
I remember that name, but I don't remember
He has a prayer.
He does that.
the prayer of
Yeah.
Jabez. Yeah.
What was his prayer about? What did he pray for?
Expanding his territory.
Is that right, Violet?
Yeah, it was, Lord bless us indeed, enlarge our territory, may your name be with us, may the evil one, and may not go faint in our hope.
Okay, very good. Woo! Do you hear that? Violet knows the prayer of
She
Jabez.
does.
Awesome.
So the prayer of Jabez was like really popular. I don't know, when was that, 20 years ago? And people were like, we should be praying that prayer, you know. And that's about all that we know about Jabez, right? I remember Beth Moore did a study on him. She said his name meant pain. And she was laughing because she said, can you imagine calling your child and be like, pain? Because he gave her a lot of pain when he
And
was
so
born.
where did he stem from?
They said it was a noble and honorable man.
Yeah, I'm not sure which line he was
Oh,
from,
okay.
but he is in chapter 4, verse 9, is where it talks about him. Another name, when I was just reading through the names, here's another one that I stopped on, and her name was Shira. Has anybody ever heard of Shira?
No.
No?
Lion King.
Is there a Shira in Lion King? Yeah.
Isn't there?
I don't know. Shira actually was a daughter of Ephraim, and it said she built 3 cities, the lower and upper Beth Horon, as well as a city called Uzan Shira. And so I just thought it was kind of cool that in the midst of this, where it's mostly men who are listed, then there's this woman, this daughter of Ephraim, who actually built cities and named one after her. And the Birish or Uzan Shira meant belonging to Shira, and so that was probably where she lived with her family. And so kind of cool to see a little girl power in the family tree, isn't it? All right, and then chapter 9 picks up the genealogy of those who are returning to Israel from exile in Babylon. So that's kind of a spoiler alert. And mostly the emphasis there is on the roles they played. So you saw priests and Levites and gatekeepers and all of these people who are coming back with a role to play, particularly oriented around the temple. And then chapter 9 ends with the genealogy of Saul. And does anybody remember what tribe Saul was from?
Benjamin.
Yeah, very good. Very good. So that's the first 9 chapters. After that, then we go to chapter 10, and it begins a new section, and that's really a summary of the reign of David. It starts with the death of Saul in chapter 10, and then we see in chapter 11 David becoming king. And then throughout you see, in First Chronicles, then you see a lot of stories about David. Mostly it's accomplishments, like conquering territories, and David actually conquered Jerusalem and decided to make it the capital, and he called it Zion, and it was later known as the City of David, right? And he wanted very badly to bring the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. You remember that story? And he wanted to establish Jerusalem as a place of worship. And so what you see in all the writings about David in Chronicles is this desire that he has to make a temple for God instead of the tabernacle. And God said he couldn't do that. Does anybody remember why God said David could not build his temple?
He had too much blood on his hands.
Yeah? Is that what you were going to say, Bryce? Too?
He killed Uriah.
Yeah.
Because Uriah was his own man. I mean, God made him a warrior.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think he's killing Uriah was part of it.
So he definitely had a lot of blood on his hands. didn't he?
Yes.
He didn't kill Uriah, he had Uriah.
Yeah. So he was guilty anyway, right? So, but then, so he said he couldn't build the temple, but God made a promise to him at the same time. So can you get somebody to read 1 Chronicles 7, verses 7 through 14? That's not right. Maybe it's 17. I think it's
That's what
17.
I'm
Yeah,
thinking.
I left off the 17, verses 7 through 14.
Now then, tell my servant David, this is what the Lord Almighty says. I took you from the pasture and from following the flock to be ruler over my people Israel. I have been with you wherever you have gone, and I have cut off all your enemies from before you. Now I will make your name like the names of the greatest men of the earth, and I will provide a place for my people Israel, and will plant them so that they can have a home of their own and no longer be disturbed. Wicked people will not oppress them anymore as they did at the beginning, and have done ever since the time I appointed leaders over my people Israel. I will also subdue all your enemies. I declare to you that the Lord will build a house for you. When your days are over and you go to be with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, and one of your own sons, and I will establish his kingdom. He's the one who will build a house for me, and I will establish his throne forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. I will never take my love away from him as I took it away from your predecessor. I will set him over my house and my kingdom forever. His throne will be established forever.
Thank you. All right, so you see a couple of covenants in that text. First is the Mosaic covenant, where God had made that promise to Moses that he would bring the people of Israel to a place that would be theirs. And then it goes into the Davidic covenant, which is the covenant he made with David that said, your house will always have someone on the throne, right? So even though David couldn't build the temple, his son would build the temple. And the reward for David would be that his family line would always be on the throne. And so a lot of what you see then in First Chronicles is reporting about David's preparation for the temple. The temple was a big deal, okay? And so the Chronicles really center around David as king, and David being a different kind of king than anybody else, and also the temple being built and established. And so the funny thing about First Chronicles is it doesn't include any of the negatives about David, so a lot of the things that we saw in Samuel, and you're like, well, that wasn't very good, right? You don't see those stories in Chronicles. Instead, it's more geared towards establishing David as a righteous leader and a model for a king that would come later. All right, let's flip over to 1 Chronicles 22, verse 5. Somebody got that?
David said, my son Solomon is young and inexperienced, and the house to be built for the Lord shall be of great magnificence and fame and splendor in the sight of the nations. Therefore, I will make preparations for it. So David made extensive preparations before his death.
Yeah. So that kind of became the dying quest of David. And that I didn't remember that about David's story, that he ended his days preparing for the temple. So he's getting all the materials that they need. He's drawing up plans for it, which is kind of reminiscent of God giving Moses the plans for the tabernacle. Now here's David coming with the plans of the temple, even though he's not going to be able to build it. He also appoints priests and Levites and musicians who will serve at the temple. And so you see in First Chronicles the genealogy of those Levites as well. And then you see the army divisions listed, and it gives 12 divisions of 24,000 men each, who rotated, who served 1 month at a time. And so you see all of this is geared towards what's going to happen after David dies. And I think that's pretty cool. That that's how he spent the remainder of his years, is building up and preparing and teaching his son what he needed to teach him. And he gave cautions to the people and to his son to be faithful. And you remember, that's what we see throughout all of the Old Testament, that when you're faithful, God blesses, and when you're not faithful, God removes his blessing. And so David wanted the kingdom to continue that way. So let's look at 1 Chronicles 28, verses 8 through 10. And this is David's charge. Anybody want to read that one?
So now I charge you in the sight of all Israel and of the assembly of the Lord and in the hearing of our God, be careful to follow all the commands of the Lord your God, that you may possess this good land and pass it on as an inheritance to your descendants. And you, my son, Solomon, acknowledge the God of your father and serve him with wholehearted devotion and with a willing mind. For the Lord searches every heart and understands every motive behind the thoughts. If you seek him, he will be found by you, but if you forsake him, he will reject you forever. Consider now, for the Lord has chosen you to build a temple as a sanctuary. Be strong and do the good work.
That was good fatherly advice, wasn't it? And later on in that chapter, he says, be strong and courageous. Where did we hear that before?
Right.
Joshua.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Okay. So then 1 Chronicles ends with David passing away and Solomon taking over as king. All right. Any questions, thoughts, or observations about 1 Chronicles?
Pretty awesome.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's continue the story then in 2 Chronicles. And it begins with Solomon and his quest for wisdom, right? We already read about that before, but that clearly was very important. And Solomon was known throughout the world as being wise, and he was famous, and he was rich, and he had it all, in part because of how he had prayed to God to give him that wisdom.
You know what I was thinking, the way it showed how David laid everything out for him. He became king, and it's like, I don't have anything to do.
Yeah.
Dad did it all before he died.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like, what else do I need? Okay, wisdom. Yeah. That sounds good.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm sure he really wanted the wisdom.
And he had to cause all the work to be done.
Yeah.
And so I'm sure that was a lot. I thought you were going to go with, look at how his dad set him up for success.
Right.
Because I think that was an important story there. And what you read, Greg, he said, Solomon is young and inexperienced.
Right.
And so he didn't want Solomon to fail, but he didn't disobey God by doing the work for him. See, if that was today, we would say, I'll just build it because you don't know what you're doing. But instead, he gave him everything he needed.
You can put the little cap on top of it.
Yeah, you can, and we'll say you did it. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So Solomon builds the temple, and he builds a royal palace for himself. And then he dedicates the temple and brings the Ark of the Covenant into it. And he dedicated it as a place for God to dwell. This is why why it was so important to build a temple, because the people of Israel wanted God to be with them. And so when they had traveled through the desert and all that, he had been with them in the tabernacle. And so they wanted to build this fantastic place for him that was worthy of God's presence. And remember the Ark of the Covenant, and God dwelled between the angels on the top of it. And so they brought that into the temple as well. And then in chapter 6, you see this amazing prayer of Solomon as a dedication of the temple. And I think that whole chapter is actually the prayer of dedication. And it's pretty phenomenal. If you get time, sometime you should read that prayer and see what it is that Solomon asks ask God to do. And then when it gets to verse 36, it says, when they sin against you, for there is no one who doesn't sin, and you become angry with them and give them over to the enemy who takes them captive to a land far away or near. And if they have a change of heart in the land where they are held captive, and repent and plead with you in the land of their captivity, and say, we have sinned, we have done wrong, and acted wickedly. And if they turn back to you with all their heart and soul in the land of their captivity where they were taken, and pray toward the land you gave their fathers, toward the city you have chosen, and toward the temple I have built for your name, then from heaven, your dwelling place, hear their prayer and their pleas, and uphold their cause, and forgive your people who have sinned against you.
That's pretty awesome.
Isn't that?
Mhm.
And I mean, and earlier he prays about foreigners in the land and about famine and plagues hitting the land. But that's really awesome because that's exactly what's
What
going to
happened.
happen, right?
Yeah.
So it's like Solomon knew, and he's like saying, I know this is all going to happen, and so when it does, would you? And how awesome then that it's recorded here in Chronicles, which those people who were coming back from exile would have been able to read and go, this is us. You know? And Solomon prayed for me, you know, and that God would forgive me if my heart was right before him. So I think that's a powerful prayer. And then the other thing I noticed in that praise, like in chapter 7, Alan, do you have your Bible?
Yeah.
Can you read 7 verses 1 through 3?
When Solomon finished praying, fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offering and the sacrifices, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple. The priest could not enter the temple of the Lord because the glory of the Lord filled it. When all the Israelites saw the fire coming down and the glory of the Lord above the temple, they knelt on the pavement with their faces on the ground, and they worshiped and gave thanks to the Lord, saying, He is good, His love endures forever.
Isn't that cool? And I was thinking about how we sing that song, and it appears 2 or 3 more times too in there that you'll see the people of Israel saying, "Give thanks to the Lord, for He is good; His love endures forever." And I just thought that was kind of awesome to see them worshiping that way when the temple was dedicated. And you see that God also has a response today to Solomon's prayer, and that's still in chapter 7 in verses 12 through 22. He says, I have heard your prayer and have chosen this place for myself as a temple for sacrifices. When I shut up the heavens so that there is no rain, or command locusts to devour the land, or send a plague among my people, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then will I hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and heal their land. Now my eyes will be open and my ears attentive to the prayers offered in this place. I have chosen and consecrated this temple so that my name may be there forever. My eyes and my heart will always be there. As for you, if you walk before me as David your father did, and do all I command, and observe my decrees and laws, I will establish your royal throne, as I covenanted with David your father, when I said you shall never fail to have a man to rule over Israel. So he's renewing that covenant with Solomon. But if you turn away and forsake the decrees and commands I have given you, and go off to serve other gods and worship them, then I will uproot Israel from my land, which I have given them, and will reject the temple I have consecrated for my name. I will make it a byword and an object of ridicule among all people. And though this temple is now so imposing, all who pass by it will be appalled and say, why has the Lord done such a thing to this land and to this temple? And people will answer, because they have forsaken the Lord, the God of their fathers, who brought them out of Egypt, and have embraced other gods, worshiping and serving them. That is why he brought this disaster on them. And so God tells them right there at the dedication of the temple that this is what's going to happen. But that verse 14 is one that we're all familiar with, isn't it? But I wonder if it conjures up those images in us to realize the reason we pray that prayer is because we've turned away from God,
Right.
as whether it's as a people or as a nation. And so what God looks for in response is that humility and a coming back to him in a repentant heart, like we talked about on Sunday.
Amen.
So it says Solomon was greater in riches and wisdom than all the other kings of the earth. And then chapter 9 ends with his death. The next section then, starting in chapter 10, reports on the kingdom of Judah and the southern tribes. So this is another thing that was interesting about Second Chronicles especially. Do you remember the two tribes? What was the southern tribe was called Judah. What was the northern tribe called?
Israel.
Israel. Okay, so Judah, and what are the tribes that are in Judah?
Benjamin and Judah.
Benjamin and Judah, and then the other 10 made up Israel, right? So in Second Chronicles, you don't hear anything about the northern tribes. So we don't hear about who all the kings in Israel or how they got carried off into captivity. It's all about the southern tribe. Anybody want to guess why that is?
Israel was from the southern tribe.
Yeah, that's a good guess. Yeah. Any other reasons?
David.
David, he was Southern, so that's where the line of Jesus comes through.
We are southern by the grace of God.
Hey,
Right.
hallelujah.
Anyway, you're right. So that's why, because Ezra's job, what he's trying to accomplish here is to trace the line of David. And all of David went through Judah. And so because he
That makes sense.
so yeah, so that's why. And Jerusalem was in the southern kingdom. And so the temple was in the southern kingdom. So it makes sense then that Second Chronicles is really about Judah and not so much about Israel. Yeah. So chapter 10 talks about Rehoboam, who was Solomon's son, who followed him as king. And Rehoboam followed some really bad advice. Does anybody remember from last week what that bad advice was?
I wasn't in team for that.
Yeah, you weren't here. That's right. Anybody else remember what the really bad advice was that Rehoboam followed?
I just remember he listened to his peers instead of his elders.
Yeah.
He increased the taxes and the government oversight on the people.
The workload.
Right,
Yeah.
workload.
Yeah.
Well, and that's when you think about Solomon was really driving the people to build all those things he was building.
Mhm.
And it required the people to fund it and to do the work and all of that. And so Rehoboam's friends said, don't lighten up on them. You should be even harder on them. And so that ended up leading essentially to the division of the two tribes, because Jeroboam then took over and became the king in the northern tribes. But nevertheless, there was still a relative of David's on the throne. And Chronicles 12:1 says, 2 Chronicles 12:1 says that after Rehoboam's position as king was established and he had become strong, he and all of Israel with him abandoned the law of the Lord. So it didn't take long at all for David's line to turn away from God. And then they were attacked by Egypt, and articles from the temple started being carried off. So after that, then you see the temple becoming more and more decayed and destroyed and losing more and more things. Remember, all the gold shields were taken, and so they had bronze shields instead. And so you just see this succession of kings in Judah, some of whom were really good, but there were still enough bad kings that overall Israel was not faithful to God. And so during the times of faithfulness, God protected them, but during times of rebellion, God handed them over to their enemies. And overall, David's line ruled over Judah for 400 years. And so the dynasty lasted for 400 years, and then they were taken off in battle. Sometimes in that 400 years, it seemed like there were times of revival, like when Josiah found the scriptures in the temple and he brought back the Passover. But then he was followed by kings that didn't do God's will. And so chapter 36 in 2nd Chronicles then with Judah's exile into Babylon. And so, do I have one more reader that can read verses 15 through 21?
Wait, where is it?
Chapter 36, verses 15 through 21. You got it, Jen?
I got it.
Okay.
Just took me a while, sorry. The
Okay.
Lord, the God of their fathers, sent persistently to them by his messengers, because he had compassion on his people and on his dwelling place. But they kept mocking the messengers of God, despising his words and scoffing at his prophets, until the wrath of the Lord rose against his people, until there was no remedy. Therefore he brought up against them the king of the Chaldeans, who killed their young men with the sword in the house of their sanctuary, and had no compassion on young man or virgin, old man or aged. He gave them all into his hands, and all the vessels of the house of God, great and small, and the treasures of the house of the Lord, and the treasures of the king and of his princes, all these he brought to Babylon. And they burned the house of the God, and broke down the wall of Jerusalem, and burned all of his palaces with fire, and destroyed all the precious vessels. He took into exile in Babylon those who had escaped from the sword, and they became servants to him and to his sons until the establishment of the kingdom of Persia, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed its Sabbaths. All the days that it lay desolate, it kept Sabbath to fulfill 70 years.
Thank you. Yeah, so it says because the people didn't follow God and they made fun of his messengers, and you see throughout the Chronicles, you'll see prophets who are speaking to them and saying, God is saying this, and they mocked them. And there was one prophet there was Micaiah, I think was his name, and the king of Israel and the king of Judah, Jehoshaphat and Ahab, decided to join forces and go to battle. And they called upon Micaiah after they called 400 prophets came in and said, yes, go do it, you'll be victorious. And then Jehoshaphat, who was the king of Judah, said, I think we should call upon a prophet of the Lord. So I don't know who those other prophets were, but they weren't prophets of the Lord, right? And so Micaiah comes in and he says, and Ahab says, I don't want to ask him. I hate him. He always prophesies bad things against me. Yeah. And so then he said, well, you're going to lose. If you go, you're going to die. And so Ahab had him put in prison, and he could only eat bread and water. And then Ahab died in that battle. And so I think that was a great representation. You see that story. That was in Kings also, but it's also told again. And it's just an example of how the people of God, they didn't want to hear from God. And so the messengers who were delivering those messages were mocked and silenced one way or another. Even though, and I think Jennifer's word said God had compassion on his people and on his dwelling place. So he didn't want to lose his people, and he didn't want the temple to be destroyed. But because of their responses, he took his hand off of them. And there, when it talks about the Sabbath rest, they were supposed to stop farming every 7 years. And that 7th year was supposed to be a year of rest for the land. And they had not been honoring that. And so giving the land, they were in captivity for 70 years. And so what that meant is the land in Israel and Judah was resting during that time. So it's almost like God made them comply with what they should have been doing all along. And that was, if you think about it, a whole generation. I mean, that 70 years is a lifetime that those people would have spent in captivity. So a lot of the people were killed rather than being taken into captivity. But some were allowed to go and be slaves. Can anybody remember from another Bible story someone who was carried off into captivity and became a slave to Nebuchadnezzar?
Daniel.
Yeah, Daniel and his 3 friends. You remember that?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so So to hear that part of the story, if you read in Daniel, or the parts of Ezekiel and parts of Jeremiah are also written during that exile. And you can see from the prophet's perspective, you can learn more about what was going on during that time and what it would be like. But not a good time in Israel's history. And then after that, there's almost this footnote about the return. And it says, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of God spoken by Jeremiah, the Lord moved the heart of Cyrus to make a proclamation throughout his realm and put it in writing. This is what Cyrus, king of Persia, says. The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build a temple for him at Jerusalem in Judah. Any one of his people among you, may the Lord his God be with him, and let him go up. And that's how Chronicles ends, with there's a new king in Persia, and he is moved by God to let the people go back. And so we'll read more about that in the coming weeks as we do Ezra and Nehemiah as well. So that's not that boring, is it?
That was
good.
nice.
That's interesting.
You made it really interesting.
Thank you so much.
You gave us such low expectations.
There you go.
I didn't go to sleep.
So yeah, you didn't go to sleep. Good job, man. So what do we learn? What's the value of Chronicles? Anybody see value in this book?
Let's see. If they'd listened to God, they wouldn't have ever gone into exile.
Yeah, that's a good lesson.
It's
Yeah.
a good record of the descendants.
Yeah.
And they were all people.
Well, they did serve other gods. I mean, we have to be careful and recognize what our gods are. You know, out of self, or out of self-motive or intent, or what is our God, you know?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. That is a good lesson to think about.
I think that Chronicles uses the stories of the past in order to give God's people hope for the future. And so sometimes you really need to know where you came from in order to know that where you're going is good, right? It's good to know things about your family, isn't it? And honestly, this family tree goes all the way back to Adam, which means every single one of us is a part of it, right?
Yeah.
This is our family tree too. And so at some point, if Ancestry.com went back far enough,
let's check. Yeah.
Yeah.
see if it's Shem, Ham, or who's the other guy? So it's our story too, and the story of God shaping his people. It also reminds us that God fulfills his promises, right? And so think about too that after the return from exile, then you have all this period of silence before the New Testament comes.
Right.
And I'm thinking about the movie that we watched the other night. Who are they waiting for? They're waiting for the Messiah. Who is the Messiah? He is a David-like king, or a Davidic king. So, and when they say that Jesus is like the David-like king, what they mean is that he's a good king and that he was righteous. And so that's why when you see David described, he's put on a much higher pedestal than the other kings. And he was a better king than the others. And even the good kings that came after him, they would say they still didn't remove all the high places. And they allowed compromise to come in. And David was bent on doing what God wanted. And that's what made him such a strong king. So, and then when Jesus came, where does his family tree go back to?
David.
On both sides, his mother and his father, you can trace him back to the same family line as David, right? So that's how God fulfilled his promise, that there would always be a king from David's line on the throne, because when Jesus came, he became the king forever. And you saw that in the promises that he made to David, that it says forever, your people will be on the throne forever.
I like that.
Yeah. And so I like too that the temple there is representative of God's dwelling place. But the change that we see in the New Testament is that the church becomes God's dwelling place, meaning the people of the church, not the building of the church, right? But it's that same filling of God's Spirit that you saw happen. And wouldn't you love to have seen the temple when it was dedicated, and to see what it looked like when God filled the temple with his presence? The priest couldn't even go in. Yeah. Wouldn't that be awesome?
Mhm.
Yeah. If you were going to have pictures of your
yeah,
that would be the money
one.
shot right there.
Right there.
So,
Yeah, I think I would have bowed on the pavement too after seeing that.
yeah, I know. And even the drawings that I had from that, I thought were powerful, because there's this big thing coming up that represents God. And then the next one was you see the temple on fire. Yeah. And what we'll read later is even when they came back, the next generations would come back and look at the temple, and it said the ones who had been there before cried because they knew what it used to be. And I wonder, when we get farther and farther away from God, if it doesn't make people weep who know what it used to be like to have a country that was dedicated to Him. And, not in perfection, but in heart. That should make us weep.
That's the
when we
truth.
get
It
far away.
does. One of the things I thought was interesting in that prayer of, I think it was the prayer of Solomon, when he was saying how when the people do this, you know, and I don't know if it was at that one or when God answered him, talking about how they would always turn in that direction and pray to God. You know, and it made me think of like now the people, the Jews that still go and pray at the Wailing Wall, because that's where the temple was. You know, that's the image I got when we read that part. I just thought that was interesting. That's kind of what they based why they pray that way, because that's where the temple was.
I thought of that too. And even people bowing to Mecca, you know, that they turn in that specific direction. And you almost get that sense when you in that, and I don't know either if it's the prayer or the response, but there's a turning towards the city and towards the temple to pray. And I thought that was a pretty cool image. Yeah. We don't have to do that because God's Spirit is in the temple. Yeah.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. All right. Any other thoughts on that? It's not that boring after all.
That was awesome. Yay.
All right. Next week we're going to talk about Ezra then. And the week after that, Tim's going to lead us in a discussion of Nehemiah.
Yay.
Looking forward to that.
Rebuild that temple.
Yeah.
The wall. Nehemiah builds the wall.
Right, that was the wall.
And we saw there, you know, there's really not a lot about their time in exile. And I think that's almost surprising. You don't see that history. Maybe because there's not that many people left even at that.
Well, in some of the prophets, they talk about it.
Yeah.
You know.
But not in a
right.
You know.
Right.
That's true. Yeah. It's almost like it didn't happen because they were in Babylon instead of in Israel.
We're not going to record this part.
Yeah.
This isn't really where we're supposed to be.
Yeah. We're not going to acknowledge it, you know. So what would happen then if we tore down all of the monuments? It's the same thing. That didn't happen. We're pretending that we didn't go through that. And so, anyway, just food for thought, isn't it? That history is important, and there's nothing else that keeps us from repeating the same mistakes sometimes. All right, I'm gonna stop recording.